In the winter of 1944, somewhere deep in the Ardennes Forest along the Belgian-German border, American soldiers were dying not from enemy bullets, but from something far more terrifying. They were lost. Completely, hopelessly lost in a frozen labyrinth of trees that all looked the same, where every shadow could hide a German patrol, and where the darkness swallowed men whole, never to be seen again. But there was something else moving through those woods at night. Something the Germans feared more than any Allied weapon. It was not a ghost, not a legend, not some supernatural force. It was a 10-year-old boy with no shoes, no family, and no reason to be alive. Yet he knew every tree, every trail, every hiding spot in that forest better than anyone who had ever set foot there. This is the story they buried in classified reports. The story of how an orphan child became the most valuable asset the Allies never officially had, and how his existence was erased from history because what he did was too dangerous, too unbelievable, and too inconvenient to ever admit. The Ardennes in 1944 was not just a forest. It was a killing ground stretched across 75 mi of dense woodland, steep ravines, and narrow dirt roads that turned to mud with the first snow. This was the stage for what would become the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the port of Antwerp. When the German offensive exploded on December 16th, it caught American forces completely off guard. Entire battalions were cut off, communication lines went dead, and thousands of soldiers found themselves scattered across hostile territory with no maps, no supplies, and no idea which direction led to safety or to a Nazi ambush. The forest became a maze of death, where men froze to death in foxholes, where the screams of wounded soldiers echoed through the trees until they suddenly stopped, and where the line between Allied and enemy territory shifted with every passing hour. In the small Belgian village of Wilhelm, tucked against the forest's edge, the locals had already learned to survive under German occupation since 1940. They knew the rules. Stay quiet, stay invisible, and never ever draw attention to yourself. The village had been emptied of most of its young men, either taken for forced labor or disappeared into the resistance. What remained were the old, the sick, and the children. Among them was a boy the villagers simply called the Shadow, because he appeared and disappeared without warning. A thin, silent child, with matted dark hair and eyes that seemed too old for his face. No one knew his real name, because he never spoke it. His parents had been killed in an Allied bombing raid in 1943. A tragic mistake that obliterated his home and left him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a knowledge of the forest that no adult could match. The boy had been living in the woods for over a year before the Americans arrived. Not in the village, not in any shelter, but actually in the forest itself, moving between abandoned hunting cabins, hollow trees, and caves that only someone desperate enough to explore would ever find. He survived by stealing from German supply depots, trapping rabbits, and eating whatever the forest provided, which was never enough. He learned the forest the way a sailor learns the sea, by necessity, by punishment, by the simple fact that one wrong turn meant death. He knew which frozen streams you could cross without breaking through the ice, which ridges offered cover from artillery, which paths the German patrols used and at what times, and most importantly, he knew how to move through total darkness without making a sound. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted and American soldiers began stumbling through the Ardennes like blind men in a nightmare, the boy watched from the shadows. He saw them walk in circles, retrace their own footsteps, argue over which direction was north, and eventually collapse from exhaustion, or get picked off by German snipers, who knew exactly where confused, desperate men would go. For 3 days he simply observed staying hidden, because trust was a luxury that war had beaten out of him. But on the 4th night, something changed. A group of 7 American soldiers, all younger than 20 years old, had taken shelter in a destroyed barn less than 200 YD from a German machine gun nest. They had no idea how close they were to being slaughtered. They were passing around a photograph of someone's girlfriend, trying to stay warm, trying to pretend they were not about to die. That was when the boy made a decision that would save hundreds of lives and cost him everything. He stepped out of the treine, walked directly toward the barn and stood in the doorway. A skeletal child in rags holding nothing but a stick. The soldiers raised their rifles, shouted in English he did not understand, and one of them nearly shot him before another knocked the barrel down. The boy did not speak. He did not need to. He simply turned around, looked back at them once, and started walking into the forest. One soldier, a corporal from Ohio named William Chen, made a choice that night. He followed, and by dawn, those 7 men were 15 miles behind German lines, safe in an Allied-held sector, because a 10-year-old orphan had guided them through the darkness using paths that did not exist on any map. Word spread fast among the scattered American units. Not through official channels, not through radio communications that the Germans could intercept, but through whispered conversations between exhausted soldiers who had seen something impossible. They talked about a ghost child who appeared at night, a boy who moved through the forest like smoke, who could lead men past enemy positions without ever being detected. Some officers dismissed it as combat fatigue, hallucinations brought on by fear and freezing temperatures. But the soldiers who had been saved knew better. They had felt the boy's hand tug at their sleeves when they were about to step on a tripwire, had watched him freeze in place seconds before a German patrol passed within arm's reach, had followed his silent gestures through minefields that would have torn them apart. By the end of December 1944, at least 40 American soldiers owed their lives to a child whose name they did not know. The boy's routine became a deadly pattern. He would emerge from the forest at dusk, always alone, always silent, and approach small groups of lost soldiers with a strange combination of caution and purpose. He never went to large formations, never approached camps with more than a dozen men. As if he understood that crowds meant danger, meant questions, meant the kind of attention that could get him killed. He would assess the soldiers with those ancient eyes, determine if they were truly lost or just resting, and then make his choice. If he decided to help, he would simply start walking. No explanation, no map, no compass, just movement. And the soldiers learned quickly. If you wanted to survive, you followed without question. You stayed quiet, and you trusted that this child knew something about the darkness that you never would. What made the boy invaluable was not just his knowledge of the terrain, but his understanding of the enemy. He had spent over a year studying German patrol patterns, learning their schedules, memorizing which units were disciplined and which were sloppy, noting where they placed sentries and where they cut corners. He knew that German soldiers smoked cigarettes at 2300 hours during shift changes, that their officers relied too heavily on main roads, that they avoided certain sections of the forest because of superstitions about wolves. This was intelligence that no reconnaissance team could have gathered. Information that existed only in the mind of a traumatized child who had weaponized his grief into survival. When he led soldiers through the forest, he was not just avoiding the enemy. He was predicting them, outthinking them, using their own habits against them. But the work was destroying him. Every night in the frozen forest burned through what little remained of his childhood. He was eating perhaps one small meal every 2 days. His body was covered in frostbite scars, and he had developed a chronic cough that rattled in his chest like stones in a can. The soldiers tried to help. They offered him food, blankets, chocolate bars, anything to make him stay, to bring him back to safety. He would accept the food, devour it in seconds with the desperation of someone who did not know when the next meal would come, and then disappear back into the trees before anyone could stop him. One medic tried to grab him, tried to force him to stay for treatment. The boy bit him hard enough to draw blood and vanished into the night. He would not be captured, not even by kindness. By mid-January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was turning in the Allies' favor. But the forest was still a nightmare of isolated skirmishes and deadly confusion. And the boy was still out there growing weaker, moving slower, but refusing to stop because he had found something in that frozen hell that his shattered mind needed more than food or warmth or safety. He had found purpose. Every soldier he saved was a small victory against the war that had taken everything from him. A tiny act of defiance against the machines and uniforms and explosions that had murdered his parents. He was not a hero. He was a ghost seeking revenge against death itself, one lost soldier at a time. The German commanders knew something was wrong. Their ambush points were being avoided with impossible precision. Patrols that should have intercepted retreating American units were finding nothing but empty trails. Supply routes that were supposed to be secret were suddenly being hit by Allied forces, who seemed to know exactly where and when to strike. At first, they suspected a spy network, maybe local resistance fighters feeding information to the Americans. They interrogated villagers, executed suspected partisans, and tightened security around their positions. But the leaks continued. What they could not comprehend, what their military doctrine had no framework to understand, was that their enemy was not a network of adults with radios and codes. It was a single starving child who had turned the forest into his weapon. The boy's methods were brutally simple, but devastatingly effective. He had created a mental map of the entire region that existed nowhere else. A map that updated itself every single night based on what he observed. He knew that the Germans had placed a machine gun nest at the crossroads near the burned mill, so he would lead soldiers through a dried creek bed that approached from the blind side. He knew that German supply trucks used the logging road every Tuesday and Thursday at dawn, so he would position American patrols in the hills above with enough time to prepare an ambush. He knew which bridges were mined, which buildings were booby-trapped, and which sections of forest the Germans had declared off-limits because they had not bothered to clear their own explosives. This was not intelligence gathering in any traditional sense. This was a child who had memorized death itself and learned how to dance around it, but the strain was becoming visible even to the soldiers he helped. His cough had worsened into something that sounded like drowning. His movements had slowed from graceful to mechanical, and his eyes had developed a distant glassy quality that medics recognized as the early stages of severe malnutrition and hypothermia. One night in late January, he led a group of 9 soldiers through a particularly dangerous stretch of forest, guiding them past 3 separate German positions in total darkness. When they finally reached Allied lines, the boy collapsed. Not dramatically, not with any sound or struggle. He simply stopped walking, sat down in the snow, and closed his eyes. The soldiers rushed to him, wrapping him in blankets, forcing hot coffee between his cracked lips, begging him to stay awake. For the first time since anyone had met him, the boy spoke, one word, barely a whisper, in broken French. Enough. They carried him to a field hospital, a converted schoolhouse, where overwhelmed doctors were performing amputations on kitchen tables and using bed sheets as bandages. The boy weighed 38 kilos, roughly half of what a healthy 10-year-old should weigh. His feet were black with frostbite. His lungs were rattling with pneumonia, and his body temperature was so low that the thermometer could not register it properly. The doctors gave him maybe 12 hours to live. They pumped him full of whatever antibiotics they had, wrapped him in every blanket they could find, and assigned a nurse to monitor him through the night. Her name was Lieutenant Sarah Brennan from Massachusetts, and she sat beside his bed, reading him stories in English that he could not understand, just so he would not die alone in silence. But the boy did not die that night. Against every medical prediction, against all logic and probability, he survived. His body, which had endured over a year of starvation and exposure, which had been pushed far beyond any reasonable limit, somehow found enough strength to keep breathing. By morning, his temperature had risen slightly. By the second day, his eyes opened. By the third day, he was sitting up, still silent, still watching everything with that unnerving intensity, but alive. The doctors called it a miracle. Lieutenant Brennan called it stubbornness. What none of them understood was that the boy was not recovering because he wanted to live. He was recovering because he was not finished yet. The military had a problem. Word of the boy had reached command levels. And suddenly there were questions that no one wanted to answer. How long had this been going on? How many missions had been influenced by intelligence from an unvetted, unidentified child? Who had authorized the use of a minor in active combat operations? The answer, of course, was that no one had authorized anything, because no one had been in control. The boy had simply inserted himself into the war, and desperate soldiers had accepted his help because the alternative was death. But now that he was in a hospital bed, now that he was a physical presence that could be documented and recorded, he became a bureaucratic nightmare. There were forms for prisoners of war, Forms for refugees, forms for resistance fighters. There was no form for a 10-year-old ghost who had saved dozens of lives without ever officially existing. Lieutenant Brennan became his unwitting guardian. She spoke no French, he spoke no English, but they developed a language of gestures and expressions that somehow worked. She brought him real food, watched him eat with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had forgotten what taste was, and noticed that he never finished a meal. He would eat exactly half of whatever was given to him, and then carefully wrap the rest in cloth, hiding it under his pillow. When she asked why, using exaggerated hand gestures, he simply pointed to the window toward the forest. She understood then he was saving it for when he went back, because in his mind, he was always going back. During his recovery, intelligence officers attempted to interview him. They brought translators, maps, photographs of German officers trying to extract the information that was locked inside his head. But the boy would not cooperate. He would not point to locations on maps, would not identify faces, would not answer questions about how he knew what he knew. He simply stared at them with those ancient eyes until they gave up and left. One particularly aggressive colonel tried to intimidate him, raising his voice and demanding answers. The boy did not flinch, did not react, did not even blink. He had survived German patrols, artillery bombardments, and starvation. A loud American officer was nothing. Lieutenant Brennan eventually banned the interviews entirely, citing medical necessity, though the real reason was that she could see what they could not. The boy was not being difficult. He was protecting something, some final piece of himself that he refused to surrender. What the officers did not realize was that the boy's silence was strategic. He understood, even at 10 years old, that the moment he became useful to the military in an official capacity, he would lose his freedom. They would assign him handlers, create protocols, turn him into an asset that could be controlled and directed, and that would destroy the only advantage he had ever possessed: the ability to move independently, to make his own decisions, to save lives on his own terms. His power came from being uncontrollable, unpredictable, impossible to command. The second he became part of the system, he would become just another tool, and tools could be discarded when they were no longer needed. By early February 1945, the boy was strong enough to walk. The doctors wanted to keep him for another month to ensure full recovery to add some desperately needed weight to his skeletal frame. But on the morning of February 8th, Lieutenant Brennan arrived at his bed to find it empty. The blankets were folded with military precision, the saved food was gone, and the window was open. He had left no note, no goodbye, no indication of where he was going. But everyone knew. He had returned to the forest, to the only home he understood, to continue the work that had become his reason for existing. And this time, no one tried to stop him. The forest had changed in the 3 weeks he had been gone. The Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. The German offensive had collapsed, and the front lines were pushing eastward toward the Rhine River. But the Ardennes were still dangerous, still filled with isolated German units that had been cut off and abandoned, stragglers who were desperate and unpredictable, and thousands of unexploded mines and artillery shells that turned every step into a potential death sentence. The organized chaos of a major battle had been replaced by something worse: a lawless wilderness where the rules of engagement no longer applied, where soldiers on both sides were simply trying to survive long enough to go home. And into this nightmare, the boy returned as if he had never left, moving through the trees with the same silent purpose, appearing at the edges of American positions like a spirit summoned by need itself. But something had shifted inside him during those weeks in the hospital. Lieutenant Brennan had done more than save his life. She had reminded him, however briefly, that human connection still existed, that not everyone in the world was an enemy or a target or a threat. He began to change his methods in small but significant ways. Instead of disappearing immediately after guiding soldiers to safety, he would sometimes linger for a few minutes, accepting their gratitude with awkward silence, even allowing them to ruffle his hair or press chocolate bars into his hands. He started leaving signs for American patrols, small markers made from stacked stones or broken branches arranged in patterns that meant safe path or danger ahead. A primitive communication system that only worked because soldiers had learned to trust anything that seemed to come from him. He was still a ghost, still untouchable and unreachable in most ways, but he was becoming a ghost that acknowledged the living. The German stragglers, meanwhile, had become aware of him in a way that was almost mythological. They whispered stories around dying fires about the forest demon, a creature that appeared as a child but moved like smoke that brought death to anyone who saw it. Some claimed he was the spirit of a murdered boy seeking revenge. Others insisted he was a trained Soviet operative made to look like a child, and a few believed he was simply madness given form, a hallucination created by exhaustion and fear. The truth that he was just an orphan with nothing left to lose was somehow more terrifying than any of the legends. One German sergeant, separated from his unit and slowly freezing to death, encountered the boy on a narrow trail. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. The sergeant raised his rifle, finger on the trigger, and the boy did not run. He simply waited, as if he had already accepted whatever came next. The sergeant lowered his weapon, stepped aside, and let him pass. He later told other survivors that shooting the boy would have felt like murdering hope itself, and hope was the only thing keeping any of them alive. By March 1945, the boy's legend had spread beyond the Ardennes. Soldiers rotating out of the region carried stories back to rear echelon units, to replacement depots, to letters sent home that described a guardian angel in the form of a starving child. Some commanders tried to investigate to verify whether this mysterious guide actually existed or was just a collective hallucination born from trauma. But every inquiry hit the same wall. Yes, soldiers had been guided to safety through impossible circumstances. Yes, there were consistent descriptions of a young boy. And no one could provide concrete proof because he never stayed long enough to be documented. He existed in that strange space between confirmed fact and military folklore. Real enough to save lives, but elusive enough to avoid official record. What none of the reports mentioned, what no soldier thought to document because it seemed too small to matter, was that the boy was getting slower. His cough had returned worse than before. His movements had lost their supernatural fluidity. And there were nights when he had to stop and rest against trees, struggling to breathe before continuing his rounds through the forest. The war was ending. The Germans were retreating, and soon there would be no more lost soldiers to save. And when that happened, when his purpose finally evaporated, the boy would have to face a question he had been avoiding since the day his parents died. What does a ghost do when there is nothing left to haunt? In late March 1945, the boy made a mistake. It was bound to happen eventually, because even ghosts get tired. Even the most careful survivors eventually miscalculate when their body is failing, and their mind is clouded by fever. He was guiding 4 American soldiers through a section of forest he had crossed dozens of times before, a route he knew so well he could have walked it blindfolded. But this time he misjudged the timing of a German patrol. They rounded a bend in the trail and found themselves face to face with 6 enemy soldiers close enough to see the shock in each other's eyes. Close enough that there was no time to run or hide. The Americans raised their weapons. The Germans did the same. And for 3 seconds that stretched into eternity, everyone waited for someone else to make the first move. The boy did not freeze. He stepped directly between the 2 groups, held up both hands, and made a gesture that transcended language. Stop. Do not do this. What happened next became one of those moments that soldiers would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to people who were not there. The German sergeant, a man named Klaus Zimmermann from Bavaria, who had been fighting since 1939, and was so exhausted he could barely remember why, looked at this skeletal child standing in no man's land, and made a decision that violated every regulation in the Wehrmacht handbook. He lowered his rifle. He spoke quietly to his men in German, and they lowered theirs. Then he looked at the American corporal, a farm kid from Iowa named Daniel Wright, and in broken English said the only thing that mattered. No children should see more death. The Americans, stunned and confused, but not stupid, lowered their weapons. Both groups stood there in the snow, enemies by definition, but united by the simple fact that they were all tired of killing. After a moment that felt like prayer, Zimmermann nodded to the boy, turned and led his men back the way they had come. The Americans watched them disappear into the trees. No shots were fired. No one died. And the boy, for the first time since anyone had known him, smiled. But the encounter had consequences neither group could have predicted. Word reached German command that Sergeant Zimmermann had deliberately avoided engagement with enemy forces, that he had allowed American soldiers to escape, and that his excuse involved a child in the forest. The response was swift and brutal. Zimmermann was arrested, court-martialed for cowardice and dereliction of duty, and executed by firing squad on April 2, 1945, less than 5 weeks before Germany surrendered. His last words, recorded by a disgusted chaplain who witnessed the execution, were about the boy. He said that if God existed, he would not waste miracles on soldiers, but he might waste one on a child who had seen too much. The chaplain included those words in his personal diary, but never in any official report. Because recording the execution of a man for refusing to kill a child would have been an admission of something the Wehrmacht could not afford to admit. The boy never learned what happened to Zimmermann. He continued his work through April as the war entered its final chaotic phase, guiding smaller and smaller groups of soldiers through a forest that was rapidly emptying of combatants. The Americans were pushing east. The Germans were collapsing, and the Ardennes was transforming from a battlefield into a graveyard of abandoned equipment and unburied dead. He found tanks rusting in clearings, supply dumps looted and scattered, entire positions abandoned so quickly that coffee was still warm in discarded canteens. The forest was reclaiming itself, and soon there would be nothing left for him to do. No one left to save, no purpose left to justify his continued existence. On April 28, 1945, 12 days before Germany officially surrendered, the boy guided his last group of soldiers to safety. They were 3 engineers who had gotten separated from their unit while clearing mines. Young men barely out of their teens who were so relieved to see him. They actually cheered. He led them through the forest one final time, delivered them to an American checkpoint, and accepted their gratitude with the same awkward silence he always had. But this time, when they offered him food and begged him to stay, he did something he had never done before. He looked directly at one of them, a kid from Philadelphia named James Chen, who reminded him somehow of Lieutenant Brennan, and he spoke. 2 words in French, soft and final. C'est fini. It is finished. Then he turned and walked back into the forest, and no one ever saw him again. The search for the boy began immediately, though not officially, and not through any proper channels. Lieutenant Brennan, who had been reassigned to a hospital in Luxembourg, heard about his final appearance, and went absent without leave, driving back to the Ardennes in a stolen jeep with nothing but a medical kit and a reckless determination to find him before the forest killed him. She searched for 6 days, calling out in broken French, leaving food at the sites where soldiers had reported seeing him, checking every abandoned cabin and cave she could find. Other soldiers joined her when they heard what she was doing, men he had saved, who felt they owed him a debt that could never be repaid. They combed through square miles of wilderness, asking villagers if they had seen a thin boy with dark hair and old eyes. But the answers were always the same. No one had seen him, or if they had, they were not saying. The forest had swallowed him whole the same way it had swallowed thousands of others, and it was not giving him back. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that the boy had made his way back to the original site where his life had ended, and his survival had begun. The ruins of his family home still stood on the outskirts of Wilm, nothing more than a foundation and scattered bricks, the place where an Allied bomb had erased his childhood in a single bright flash in October 1943. He had not returned there since the day it happened, had spent over a year avoiding it, as if proximity to that memory might finish the job the bomb had started. But now, with the war ending, and his purpose evaporating, he went back to the only place that had ever truly been his. He sat in the rubble where his kitchen had once stood, where his mother had baked bread, and his father had read him stories, and he waited. Not for rescue, not for salvation, but simply for whatever came next. A village priest named Father Maurice Dubois found him 3 days later, barely conscious, his body finally surrendering to the pneumonia and malnutrition and exhaustion that he had been outrunning for months. The priest had been checking the ruins periodically. leaving food and blankets for refugees who sometimes sheltered there. And he nearly walked past the boy, because he looked so much like another piece of broken rubble. But then he saw the shallow breathing, the slight movement of a chest that refused to stop fighting, and he gathered the child into his arms and carried him to the village church. He sent word through the rapidly reorganizing civilian networks, and within hours, Lieutenant Brennan was there along with a military doctor and 2 of the soldiers the boy had saved. They set up an improvised medical station in the church basement, using equipment screeded from abandoned field hospitals, and they fought to keep him alive with the same desperate intensity he had once used to keep them alive. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness for 9 days. In his lucid moments, he would stare at the ceiling of the church basement, at the stone arches and the small window that let in weak spring sunlight, and something in his expression suggested he was disappointed to still be breathing. Lieutenant Brennan stayed with him constantly, sleeping in a chair beside his cot, talking to him in English about anything and everything, about her life in Massachusetts, about the ocean, about a future where the war was over and children did not have to guide soldiers through forests. She had no idea if he understood a single word, but she talked anyway because silence felt like surrender. On the 8th night, he opened his eyes, looked directly at her, and spoke in clear, deliberate French. Father Dubois, who was dozing nearby, translated immediately. The boy had said, "Tell them I was not brave, I was only angry." On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, while the world celebrated the end of the war with fireworks and dancing and tears of joy, the boy opened his eyes for the last time in that church basement. Lieutenant Brennan was holding his hand. Father Dubois was praying quietly in the corner, and 2 soldiers were standing guard at the door, as if they could protect him from death itself. The boy looked at each of them in turn, his expression finally soft, finally at peace, and then he closed his eyes and stopped breathing. The doctor tried to revive him, pounding on his tiny chest, forcing air into his damaged lungs, but it was over. His body, which had survived impossible cold and starvation, and a year of living like a hunted animal, had simply decided it had done enough. He died the same day the war ended, as if he'd been waiting for permission to stop fighting. He was 10 years old, though no one knew his exact birth date. He had saved at least 73 soldiers that could be confirmed, and probably twice that number who never reported it. And no one had ever learned his name. They buried him in the cemetery behind the church in Vils, in a plot that Father Dubois had reserved for victims of the war, whose names had been lost. Lieutenant Brennan wanted to take his body back to the United States to give him a proper military funeral with honors and recognition. But the priest refused gently but firmly. He explained that the boy belonged to the forest, to the village, to the land that had tried to kill him, but had also made him into something extraordinary. The funeral was small, attended by perhaps 20 people, a handful of villagers who remembered him as the Silent Shadow. Father Dubois, Lieutenant Brennan, and 7 American soldiers who had traveled from their units without permission to pay their respects. There was no casket, because they could not find one small enough, so they wrapped him in a clean white sheet. And when they lowered him into the ground, Lieutenant Brennan placed beside him the only possessions he had ever kept, a small piece of cloth containing saved food, and a photograph of a woman and man that had been found in his pocket, so faded and damaged it was almost unrecognizable. His parents probably, though no one could confirm it. The military response to his death was bureaucratic chaos wrapped in willful ignorance. When Lieutenant Brennan filed reports requesting posthumous recognition for the boy, requesting that his actions be documented and honored, she was met with a wall of procedural objections that barely concealed official discomfort. The Army had no framework for honoring a foreign child who had never been enlisted, never been authorized, and whose very existence raised uncomfortable questions about how desperate the situation had truly been. There were concerns about international law regarding child soldiers, concerns about admitting that American forces had knowingly allowed a minor to operate in combat zones, and concerns about the propaganda implications if the story became public. One particularly tone-deaf colonel suggested that acknowledging the boy would make the United States military look incompetent, as if they had needed a child to do their job. The reports were filed, stamped, and disappeared into archives where they were classified not for reasons of national security, but for reasons of institutional embarrassment. Lieutenant Brennan refused to let it end there. She spent the next 6 months tracking down every soldier she could find who had been helped by the boy, collecting testimonies, building a case for recognition that could not be ignored. She found men scattered across Europe and the United States, farm boys and factory workers and college students who had gone back to their normal lives, but who still carried the memory of a thin child appearing out of darkness to save them. Their stories were remarkably consistent. The boy never spoke, never asked for anything in return, and moved through the forest with knowledge that seemed impossible for someone his age. One soldier, a lieutenant from California named Robert Hayes, had kept a journal throughout the war, and he had dedicated 7 full pages to describing the night the boy had guided his platoon through a minefield in total darkness, weaving between buried explosives with such precision that Hayes was convinced they were all going to die until they suddenly reached safety. These testimonies formed a document that was over 80 pages long, a monument in paper to a child who had done more for the war effort than most decorated officers. The document was submitted to the War Department in November 1945, with a formal request that the boy be awarded the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor the United States could bestow. The request was reviewed, discussed in closed meetings that Lieutenant Brennan was not allowed to attend, and ultimately denied in February 1946. The official reason given was lack of verification of identity, which was technically true, but functionally meaningless. The real reason, which was never written down, but was understood by everyone involved, was that the story was too complicated, too messy, and too potentially damaging to official narratives about American military competence. The decision was final. The file was sealed, and Lieutenant Brennan was strongly encouraged to drop the matter and focus on her career if she wanted to have one. She did not drop it. She resigned her commission in March 1946, moved to Belgium, and spent the rest of her life in Vils, teaching English to local children and maintaining the boy's grave. Every year on May 8th, she would place fresh flowers on the simple stone marker that read only Unfur, a child of the forest, because even in death, no one could give him back his name. She became a local fixture, the American woman who had stayed behind, and she told the boy's story to anyone who would listen to school children and historians and journalists, keeping his memory alive through sheer stubborn refusal to let him be forgotten. She died in 1987 at the age of 73, and she was buried beside him, her headstone facing his. 2 people who had saved each other in different ways. The story should have ended there, buried in a Belgian cemetery alongside 2 people who had refused to let war define them. But stories like this have a strange way of refusing to stay dead, especially when they are built on truth that someone tried very hard to erase. In 1998, a historian named Dr. Elizabeth Warren from Columbia University was researching unclassified World War II documents when she stumbled across a peculiar pattern in after-action reports from the Ardennes campaign. Multiple units reported being guided to safety by local assets who were never identified. Navigation through enemy territory that defied tactical logic and references to a recurring figure described only as the local or the guide. The reports were scattered across dozens of files, never connected, never analyzed as part of a larger pattern. But when Dr. Warren compiled them chronologically and geographically, they all pointed to the same approximate area and the same 3-month period. She had found the paper trail of a ghost. Her investigation led her to Vam, to Father Dubois' successor, who still maintained church records, and eventually to a box of letters that Lieutenant Brennan had left to the parish when she died. The letters contained everything: the testimonies she had collected, photographs of the boy's grave, copies of the denied requests for recognition, and her own detailed account of those final days in the church basement. Dr. Warren spent 2 years verifying the story, tracking down surviving soldiers who were now in their 70s and 80s, men who had never forgotten the child who had saved them, but who had assumed no one would believe them if they spoke about it. One veteran, James Chen, the last soldier the boy had guided, had kept a small stone from the Ardennes Forest on his desk for 53 years, a tangible reminder that it had all been real. When Dr. Warren interviewed him, he wept openly, saying he had waited his entire life for someone to ask about the boy. The story was published in the Journal of Military History in 2000, a meticulously researched article titled The Unnamed Guide of the Ardennes: Child Resistance and Unofficial Intelligence in the Battle of the Bulge. It caused a minor sensation in academic circles, spawning follow-up research, documentary proposals, and renewed pressure on the Department of Defense to declassify related files. Some of those files were released in 2003, heavily redacted but confirming the basic facts. Yes, there had been reports of a child providing navigational assistance. Yes, multiple commanders had been aware of it. And yes, the decision had been made to not pursue official recognition due to policy complications regarding minors in combat zones. The documents were clinical, bureaucratic, stripped of any humanity, but they were proof the boy had existed. His actions had been real, and the military had chosen institutional convenience over honoring a child who had bled for their cause. The Belgian government, less constrained by bureaucratic cowardice than their American counterparts, responded differently. In 2007, on the 62nd anniversary of VE Day, they held a ceremony at the cemetery in Vilsam. They erected a proper monument, a bronze statue of a small figure leading the way through darkness, and they gave him an official designation, Lugardia Inconu, the unknown guardian. The ceremony was attended by the Belgian Minister of Defense, the American ambassador to Belgium, 3 surviving soldiers the boy had saved, and over 200 villagers. They read the names of the 73 confirmed soldiers whose lives he had preserved, a litany that took 11 minutes to complete. And then they stood in silence for the thousands of others whose stories had never been recorded. The American ambassador gave a speech acknowledging that sometimes nations fail their heroes, and that recognition delayed is not the same as recognition denied, but it is better than eternal silence. But perhaps the most important moment of that ceremony was not official at all. After the dignitaries had left and the crowd had dispersed, an elderly man approached the monument alone. His name was Klaus Zimmermann Jr., and he was the son of the German sergeant who had been executed for refusing to kill the boy. He had spent decades researching his father's final days, trying to understand why a decorated soldier had been shot by his own army. And the answer had led him here, to this grave, to this story. He placed a single white rose at the base of the monument, stood at attention in a posture his father had taught him 70 years earlier, and saluted not to the war, not to any flag or ideology, but to the memory of a child who had proven that even in the darkest forests, even in the midst of mechanized hatred, individual human beings could still choose mercy. He stayed there for an hour, and when he finally left, his face carried an expression that looked almost like relief, as if a weight that had been crushing his family for generations had finally lifted. Today, if you visit the cemetery in Vilsam, you will find that the boy's grave has become something unexpected, a pilgrimage site for people who believe that courage is not about strength or training or even survival, but about choosing to help others when you have every reason to save only yourself. Veterans leave medals they earned but feel they did not deserve, pinning them to the fence around the monument with notes that say, "This belongs to you." Parents bring their children and tell them the story, using it as a lesson about resilience and purpose, and the idea that age does not determine significance. Historians come with notebooks and cameras, still trying to piece together the final gaps in his story, still hoping that somewhere in an attic or a forgotten archive, they will find a name, a birth certificate, a school record, anything that will let them call him something other than the boy. But 79 years after his death, he remains unnamed, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Because without a name, he becomes universal. He becomes every child who has been forced to grow up too fast, every orphan who has turned grief into purpose, every invisible person who has saved lives without asking for recognition. The soldiers he saved went on to live full lives that would not have existed without him. They became teachers, engineers, fathers, grandfathers, ordinary people who contributed to the world in quiet but meaningful ways. When Dr. Warren calculated the total number of descendants those 73 confirmed soldiers had produced, accounting for children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, the number exceeded 400 people by 2015. 400 lives that exist because a starving child chose to step out of the shadows and guide lost men through darkness. That number will only grow with each passing generation. An expanding ripple of existence that traces back to a boy whose own life was measured in suffering and cold and hunger, but who created more life through his actions than most people could create through a century of comfortable living. This is his true legacy, not monuments or ceremonies or historical articles, but the simple fact that the world contains people who would not exist if he had chosen differently. The story raises uncomfortable questions that militaries still struggle to answer. How many other children contributed to wars in ways that were never documented because acknowledging them would be politically inconvenient? How many acts of extraordinary courage were erased from history because they did not fit neat categories, or because they embarrassed the institutions they benefited? The boy's story survived only because Lieutenant Brennan refused to let it die, because she was willing to sacrifice her career and her country, fight to preserve the truth. But how many similar stories disappeared because there was no one stubborn enough or brave enough to fight for them? Military archives are filled with gaps, with redacted files, with reports that were classified not to protect national security, but to protect institutional reputation. Every one of those gaps might contain another child, another hero who was deemed too complicated to honor. What makes this story particularly relevant today is what it reveals about the nature of heroism itself. We have constructed an elaborate mythology around heroism that requires certain elements: training, equipment, authority, recognition. We want our heroes to be soldiers or firefighters or doctors, people with credentials and uniforms and official sanction. But the boy had none of that. He had no training except what trauma had taught him, no equipment except knowledge purchased with suffering, no authority except what desperate people granted him, and no recognition except what he earned one saved life at a time. He was heroic not because he was exceptional, but because he was broken and chose to use his brokenness as a tool to help others. That is a kind of heroism that cannot be manufactured or taught or rewarded. It can only be witnessed and remembered. So remember him. Remember that somewhere in the Ardennes Forest in the winter of 1944 and 45, a 10-year-old orphan with no name, no family, and no reason to care whether American soldiers lived or died chose to care anyway. Remember that he guided them through darkness, not because it was his duty, or because anyone ordered him to, but because saving lives gave meaning to a life that war had tried to render meaningless. Remember that he died on the same day the war ended, as if his purpose and the conflict were so intertwined that neither could exist without the other. And remember that 79 years later, despite every attempt to erase him from official memory, his story survived because truth has a way of refusing to stay buried, especially when it is carried by people who understand that some debts can never be repaid, but must always be honored. The boy saved soldiers. Lieutenant Brennan saved his story. And now you carry both forward, which means in the most important way possible, neither of them is truly gone.